He was often compared to Jack the Ripper because of the horrific wounds he left on his victims. Some details of the attacks never even made it into the papers because editors considered them too brutal to print. Like the Ripper, he hunted at night and attacked women out on the streets. At first, his victims were only women involved in prostitution. But over time, it became clear that in Yorkshire, no woman felt safe anymore. On October 30, 1975, a milkman in the northern part of Leeds came across the body of a woman lying on the grass in a park near Harrogate Road. When the first officers arrived, it was immediately clear that this had been an exceptionally brutal killing. The victim's blouse had been torn, her bra removed, and her pants pulled down to her knees. Investigators found 15 stab wounds to her neck, chest, and abdomen. On top of that, she had been struck twice in the head with such force that her skull was shattered. Detectives believe the blows were delivered with a heavy object, most likely a hammer. Victim was identified as Wilma McCann. She was 28 years old. Originally from Scotland, she was killed only about 100 yards from her home. None of the neighbors reported seeing or hearing anything suspicious. The medical examiner concluded that the fatal injury was the blow to the head, and that the stab wounds were most likely inflicted after death. The night before, McCann had been at a bar. Over the course of a few hours, according to the forensic findings, she had consumed between 12 and 14 alcoholic drinks before heading home. She was struggling financially and had turned to sex work to support her children. There was no evidence of rape. It also turned out that her wallet was missing. So early on, police leaned toward the theory that it had been a robbery gone wrong. But the case went nowhere. The investigation continued, yet police still had no clear answers. On January 20, 1976, another murder took place in Yorkshire. This time, the victim was 42-year-old Emily Jackson, a woman involved in sex work. Just like in the Wilma McCann case, the body was found early in the morning by a man on his way to work. Jackson was partially undressed, and she had been struck twice in the head. Investigators believe the weapon was, once again, a hammer. But that was only part of it. Her body had 52 stab wounds. The first wounds were made with a screwdriver to the neck, chest, and abdomen. After that, the killer stabbed her several times in the back and inserted a piece of wood, about 2 to 3 feet long, between her legs. There was a clear Wellington boot print on her thigh, which led investigators to believe the killer had also stomped on her body. The autopsy showed that Jackson had engaged in sexual activity before her death, but specialists found no signs of rape. Even the police were shocked by how brutal this murder was. Almost immediately, detectives linked the crime to the murder of Wilma McCann 3 months earlier. The similarities were too obvious to ignore. In practical terms, the only solid piece of evidence was the Wellington boot print. Police were able to determine the shoe size, as well as the type and manufacturer of the boot, but even that was not enough to identify a suspect. On February 5, 1977, more than a year after the murders of Wilma McCann and Emily Jackson, another body was found on a vacant lot near a sports center in Leeds. Police almost immediately recognized the same pattern. 28-year-old Irene Richardson had been struck several times in the head with a hammer, then stabbed in the neck, chest, and abdomen. As in the previous 2 cases, the killer had partially undressed the victim. Experts found no signs of rape. Once it became known that Richardson, like the 2 women before her, had been involved in prostitution, the parallels were hard to miss. Talk of a new Jack the Ripper began to grow louder. More and more often, the press wrote that a dangerous serial killer was roaming the streets of Leeds. On April 23, 1977, police received a call from an unidentified man who said he had found his girlfriend dead in her home. The victim was 32-year-old Patricia Atkinson, a woman who occasionally engaged in prostitution. The moment officers saw the body, they had little doubt they were dealing with the same killer. Atkinson was lying on the bed, partially unclothed. She had been struck 4 times in the head with a hammer, stabbed 6 times in the abdomen, and slashed along her side. On one of the bed sheets, investigators found a clear Wellington boot print. The size matched what they had seen before, around a size 6. The same kind of print had already been found on Emily Jackson's body. For detectives, it was one more sign that all of these murders were connected. Even though the Ripper case had already put people on edge, the morning of June 26, 1977, changed everything. Near a playground, 2 children found a body. The victim was 16-year-old Jane McDonald. She had been struck 3 times in the head with a hammer, then stabbed repeatedly in the chest, and once in the back. By then, the killer's pattern was already painfully familiar to police. But this time, it was different. Unlike the earlier victims, Jane had no connection to prostitution. The night before, she had been out with friends, then started walking home alone to her parents' house. Somewhere along the way, she was attacked. She came from a stable family, did not drink or use drugs, had recently finished school, and worked in a shoe store. Nothing about her life matched the profile that had been associated with the earlier murders. It was after this killing that the press almost immediately gave the murderer the name, the Yorkshire Ripper. The fear spread far beyond one city. Before long, the entire country was on edge. Very quickly, he became public enemy number 1 across the country, because by then, it was no longer just women involved in prostitution who seemed to be at risk. After the murder of Jane McDonald, it became clear that any woman could be a target. That was the moment when the investigation sparked a much wider public backlash. Authorities realized the old approach was no longer working, and they began restructuring the investigation. An experienced officer, George Oldfield, was put in charge of the hunt for the killer. His team focused exclusively on the crimes believed to be connected to the Ripper. But that only happened after Jane McDonald was killed. And that is exactly why people kept asking a harder question. Why hadn't this been done sooner? What angered many people even more was the implication behind it all. Did the system value the life of a woman involved in prostitution less than the life of a respectable victim? At a press conference, police more or less suggested that the McDonald case was different. The message, whether intended or not, was that this time the killer had attacked an innocent girl, and that was what truly shocked the public. After those remarks, tensions in Britain only got worse, and public opinion split sharply. Against that backdrop, the attitude toward the earlier victims became impossible to ignore. In that climate of deep everyday sexism, many people genuinely believed that women in the sex trade were somehow responsible for what had happened to them. That distinction felt openly degrading, and critics said both the authorities and parts of the press were reinforcing it. The debate quickly moved beyond public discussion. Activists and support groups began taking to the streets, demanding apologies and accusing police of hostility toward women. At the same time, almost everyone agreed on one thing: the killer had to be stopped, no matter what. Graffiti calling for the Ripper to be hanged began appearing in cities. Women in Yorkshire were urged not to go out alone at night, and police regularly swept through red light districts. The investigation grew fast, and on a massive scale. Hundreds of officers were involved, around 175,000 people were questioned, and roughly 12,500 statements were collected. But even with numbers like that, the case barely moved forward. On the morning of October 10, 1977, another victim was found. Behind some bushes on a lot in Manchester lay the naked, badly mutilated body of Jean Jordan. She was 21 years old, worked in prostitution, and had already been dead for more than a week by the time she was found. The killer had struck her in the head 11 times with a hammer. Her face was so badly damaged that Jean could only be identified through fingerprints. Investigators also noticed bruising on her body and believed she had been kicked. There was something else, too. The killer had apparently tried to sever her head using a piece of broken glass. He had used that same glass to slash her face. This time, police had a lead that looked far more promising than anything they had before. Jordan's handbag was found at the scene, and inside a small inner pocket was a brand new £5 note. Using the serial number, the bank was able to trace where it had come from. It turned out that note could have been included in the pay packets of about 8,000 workers. All of them were checked, and one of them was Peter Sutcliffe, a 31-year-old truck driver from Bradford. Jean Jordan had disappeared on October 1st, but Sutcliffe said he had been at a family party that night, and that alibi checked out. 6 days later, police came back to him again, but his story held up then too. In the end, investigators never seriously treated him as a main suspect. On Friday, February 3, 1978, a young woman went to police and reported her 18-year-old sister, Helen Ritzka, missing. The two of them had only recently gotten involved in prostitution, and Helen had already been gone from home for 3 days. Later, her naked body was found on the grounds of a partially collapsed wooden warehouse. She had been struck several times in the back of the head with a hammer, then stabbed multiple times in the area of the heart and lungs. Unlike the other victims, investigators concluded that Helen had most likely been raped by her attacker. On March 8, 1978, Detective George Oldfield received a taunting letter that sounded as if it had been written by the killer himself. By then, both police and newspaper offices had already received similar messages more than once, but almost all of them had turned out to be hoaxes. This letter had one detail that made it feel different. It mentioned a 1975 murder, the killing of Joan Harrison in Preston, which had mistakenly been linked to the Yorkshire Ripper at the time. It was believed that detail had never been made public, and that was exactly why the letter seemed credible. Oldfield took it seriously. Part of the letter was even released to the public in the hope that someone might recognize the handwriting, but nothing came of it. A few weeks later, on March 26, 1978, another body was found on the edge of Bradford's Chinatown. The victim was 21-year-old Yvonne Pearson, a woman involved in prostitution. Her body was discovered beneath an old couch at a scrapyard after a passerby noticed the strong smell of decomposition and called police. What they found was grim. The killer had stuffed part of the couch padding into her mouth. Investigators believed he may have done that to keep her from screaming. Pearson had been struck several times with a hammer in the head and chest, and according to the medical findings, those injuries caused her death. She also had broken ribs. Detectives believed the killer had jumped on her body until they broke. It was later determined that Yvonne had been dead for about 2 months before she was found. But one detail immediately stood out to investigators. Under her arm was a copy of the Daily Mirror dated much later. That meant the killer had come back to the scene almost a month after the murder. Police believed he left the newspaper there on purpose, as a way of mocking the investigation. On May 17, 1978, the body of another woman was found near a parking lot in Manchester, among piles of rubble and construction debris. The victim was 40-year-old Vera Millward. She worked as a nurse and occasionally engaged in prostitution to support her family. The killer struck her in the head with a hammer, crushing her skull. After that, he slit open her abdomen so badly that her internal organs were exposed. Investigators also found several wounds to her chest and back. The Yorkshire Ripper's crimes shook the entire country. People were finding it harder and harder to understand how, with a manhunt this large, police still could not catch the killer. Large posters went up all across Yorkshire, and a £15,000 reward was offered for any information that could lead to him. After that, police were flooded with thousands of calls. People began suspecting husbands, friends, co-workers, and neighbors. The investigation was becoming more expensive and more exhausting by the day. It demanded huge amounts of time, manpower, and effort. No one felt that pressure more than George Oldfield, who was overseeing the entire operation. And then, at that exact moment, something happened that no one expected. The killings suddenly stopped. Months passed, and the press started floating all kinds of theories. Some believed the Yorkshire Ripper might have died maybe from an illness or some kind of accident. Others thought the pressure of the investigation had finally gotten to him. Under that theory, he may have simply left Yorkshire, or even left the UK altogether and continued attacking somewhere else. The special task force created to investigate the case kept working, even though police still had very few truly solid leads. Along with the shoe size, investigators had the brand new £5 note found after the murder of Jean Jordan, as well as tire tracks that had been linked to several crime scenes. Taken together, it all pointed to the same pattern. The killer was most likely picking up his victims, driving them to isolated places, and attacking them there. Authorities released several composite sketches of the suspected killer, and every major news outlet published them in the hope that someone would recognize him. The sketches were based on accounts from women who had survived attacks. Many of them had in fact ended up in the hospital after being struck in the head with a hammer and stabbed between 1975 and 1978. But even then, the image of the Ripper remained blurry. Some women described a tall man with light hair. Others remembered someone shorter, with dark hair, a mustache, or a beard. Those conflicting descriptions only made the investigation more confused. It was later discovered that some of the similar attacks police had tried to link to the Ripper may actually have been the work of copycats or entirely different offenders. 11 months had passed since the last known attack when, on the night of Wednesday, April 4, 1979, the Ripper struck again. His next victim was 19-year-old Josephine Whitaker, a clerk at a building society. That evening, she had been visiting her grandparents, and around midnight, she started walking home through the Savile Park area of Halifax. Her family remembered her as a very responsible young woman. She never stayed out without letting someone know. But that night, her parents did not immediately realize Josephine had never come home. The next morning, her 13-year-old brother David went out to deliver newspapers. As he rode past the park, he saw a crowd and several police cars. He stopped to see what had happened and noticed a body lying on the grass, covered with a blanket. Sticking out from underneath it was a woman's leg in a high-heeled shoe. Panicked, he rushed home and told his parents. They immediately realized Josephine was not in her room. Josephine had been attacked from behind. A blow from a hammer shattered her skull. After that, the killer stabbed her 21 times with the screwdriver in the chest and stomach. He also struck her 6 more times in the right thigh. On top of that, he bit one of her breasts and inflicted a wound in the vaginal area. Near the body, investigators found a shoe print matching a size 6, the same kind of print that had already appeared in the murders of Emily Jackson and Patricia Atkinson. After that, police had little doubt left. The Ripper was back. On June 17, 1979, George Oldfield received an audio cassette. The sender claimed the voice on it was the killer himself. It was the same person who had already been sending taunting letters the year before. On the tape, a man calling himself Jack mocked the police and flatly said the murders would continue. Oldfield was convinced he was hearing the voice of the Yorkshire Ripper, so he played the recording at a press conference and asked the media to spread it as widely as possible, hoping someone would recognize the speaker. Experts said the man on the tape had a clear Wearside accent. After that, the investigation shifted sharply toward northeast England. But that was far from Bradford, where Peter Sutcliffe was actually living. At the same time, FBI agents Robert Ressler and John Douglas were in England teaching courses at the British Police Academy, and they were brought in to consult on the case. They reviewed the case files, studied the photographs, read the letters, and listened to the tape. After that, both men warned that, in their view, the person behind the recording was not the Ripper at all, and was most likely just a hoaxer. Ressler told Oldfield directly that police were following a false lead, pointing out that an offender with this kind of profile would be unlikely to contact investigators on his own. But Oldfield did not trust their conclusions, and he ignored the advice from Ressler and Douglas. On September 2, 1979, the body of 20-year-old Barbara Leach, a student at the University of Bradford, was found in trash bins. The attack had happened the night before. The killer struck her several times with a hammer and then stabbed her 8 times with a screwdriver. Once again, the murder showed that the Ripper's victims did not fit into any single pattern. At that point, most of the weight of the case was still falling on Detective George Oldfield. He remained almost obsessed with the letters and the audio recording supposedly sent by the killer, and by then, it was obvious the investigation had stalled. The strain took a serious toll on his health. On August 6, 1979, Oldfield collapsed with what was first described as a chest infection and later identified as a heart attack. After that, he never returned to the investigation. On August 20, 1980, 47-year-old civil servant Marguerite Walls was found dead. She had been hit in the head with a hammer and then strangled with a rope. Her body was found in Leeds, near a garden. She was completely naked, and there were no stab wounds on her body. At first, investigators did try to connect the murder to the Ripper, although the pattern looked slightly different. Later, though, the investigation did conclude that Marguerite Walls was one of his victims. Then, on the night of September 24, 1980, 34-year-old Singaporean Dr. Upadhyaya Bandara became the target of another attack. At around 10:30 that night, she was walking down an alley in Leeds when her attacker struck her twice in the head with a hammer and then looped a rope around her neck. A nearby resident heard the noise, came outside to see what was happening, and immediately called police. That is what saved Bandara's life. The attacker did not have time to finish what he started and fled the scene. The method of attack looked strikingly similar to the murder of Marguerite Walls, and that immediately raised concern among investigators. Even though neither woman fit the victim profile most commonly associated with the Yorkshire Ripper at the time, everything pointed to the same man. Police now had to deal with the picture that had become even more disturbing. On the night of November 17 into November 18, 1980, 20-year-old student Jacqueline Hill was found dead in Leeds. Her body was lying near the exit of a parking lot. The attack was especially brutal. The killer stabbed her several times with a screwdriver in the chest and abdomen, and one of the blows went into her eye. As in the earlier cases, her skull had been crushed with a hammer. After those killings, a new wave of protests spread across the country. Men and women in cities across England took to the streets with one demand: the Ripper had to be caught. Too much time had passed, and there was still no real progress. Even after a separate team had been assigned to focus only on this case, the investigation kept circling back to the same old leads. Detectives went back once again to the trail of the new £5 note. They managed to narrow the pool of possible suspects to around 250 men, but that still led nowhere. At the same time, police were checking the registration numbers of thousands of cars seen in the red light districts of Leeds, Bradford, and Manchester on the days of the murders. Drivers were interviewed one by one, but that line of inquiry also came up empty. As the investigation stalled, the press became more and more openly critical of the police. By then, the Ripper had already killed 13 women and was still free. On the night of January 2, 1981, 2 police officers were patrolling the red light district on Melbourne Avenue in Sheffield. They noticed a woman getting into a car with a man and decided to see what was going on. There was no formal reason to stop them, but something about the situation seemed off. The driver gave his name as John Williams and stayed calm throughout the encounter. When officers asked who the woman was, he said she was his girlfriend, but he could not tell them her name. The officers asked him to step out of the car. He asked if he could go relieve himself in the bushes, and they allowed it, while continuing to watch him. When he came back, He was told the car was carrying false license plates. After that, both he and the woman were taken to the station. Once at the station, police learned his real name was Peter William Sutcliffe. He was 34 years old, worked as a truck driver, and lived in Bradford. Sutcliffe admitted the plates were stolen and said he had picked them up at a scrapyard near Murfield, in the Cooper Bridge area. Investigators quickly realized this was not some unknown man. Sutcliffe had already come up more than once in the Ripper investigation, including in connection with that same £5 note. Even so, he seemed more worried about how his wife would react to him being picked up with a prostitute than about the fact that he was now at the center of a serial murder investigation. So police decided to hold him and keep digging. By that point, investigators already had the feeling that the man they had been hunting for years might be sitting in a cell right in front of them. Sutcliffe's car was searched carefully, but at first, nothing suspicious turned up. Still, one of the officers felt they had missed something important. He went back to Melbourne Avenue and decided to check the bushes one more time, the same bushes where the suspect had gone to relieve himself. That is where they found a hammer, a knife, and a length of rope. Around the same time, another knife was discovered in the restroom Peter William Sutcliffe had used. It had been hidden inside the toilet tank. By then, the team leading the Ripper investigation had already been alerted, and the entire case shifted into a very different gear. When Sutcliffe was told the weapons had been found, he stayed calm. He did not deny it for long. He admitted that he was the Yorkshire Ripper. Later, he said, "Yes, it's me. I would have killed that girl if I hadn't been caught." Soon after that, police held a press conference and announced that, after 6 years of searching, the Ripper had finally been arrested. For many people, it was an enormous relief, and the news spread far beyond Britain almost immediately. But along with that relief came more criticism. A lot of people believed the arrest was not the result of flawless police work, but of sheer luck. After 17 hours of questioning, on January 5, 1981, Sutcliffe was formally taken into custody and charged with the murder of Jacqueline Hill. Then, on February 20, he was officially charged with 13 murders and 7 attempted murders linked to the Yorkshire Ripper case. The preliminary hearing was held on April 29, 1981. In court, Peter William Sutcliffe said he was not guilty of murder. At the same time, he did admit to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. In other words, he did not deny committing the crimes, but insisted that he had been mentally ill at the time of the attacks. The prosecution was prepared to accept that position, based on the findings of psychiatric experts. After several evaluations, specialists concluded that Sutcliffe was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. But Mr. Justice Boreham did not agree. He rejected the argument for diminished responsibility and made it clear that the question of sanity had to be decided by a jury. A full trial was then scheduled for May 5, 1981. The public was deeply unsettled. A lot of people understood what was at stake. If Peter Sutcliffe were found insane, he would be sent to a psychiatric hospital instead of prison. And to a great many people, that felt far too lenient. That is why one question kept getting louder. Was Peter Sutcliffe truly insane? Or was he simply trying to avoid full responsibility for what he had done? Peter William Sutcliffe was born on June 2, 1946, in Shipley, a small town about 9 kilometers from Bradford. He was the oldest child in a deeply religious family, headed by John William and Kathleen Sutcliffe. As a boy, Peter was often sick, withdrawn, and very attached to his mother. He did fine in school, but he had almost no friends and mostly kept to himself. He spent a lot of time alone. According to later accounts, he could lock himself in the bathroom for long stretches, just staring at himself in the mirror. At that age, he showed very little interest in girls. At 15, Sutcliffe dropped out of school and went to work at a cemetery. 3 years later, he was fired for chronic lateness, though his supervisors still considered him a hard-working employee. Co-workers described him as quiet and friendly. As he got older, he became more and more self-conscious about his looks and his height, which led him to take up weightlifting and follow a strict diet. In time, he did start getting attention from women, but because of his withdrawn personality, those relationships did not last. At 21, he met a 16-year-old girl, and the two began a relationship. In 1970, the Sutcliffe family went through a major scandal. His mother, Kathleen, was caught having an affair, and for Peter, who was deeply attached to her, it was a devastating blow. He practically idolized her and took what happened very hard. Later, that episode was often described as one of the events that had a profound effect on the way he viewed women. Soon after that, Peter began spending time in red light districts. At first, he only watched from a distance. Then he started getting closer. Eventually, he moved on to attacks. Later, Sutcliffe claimed that from around the age of 20, he had been hearing the voice of God telling him to kill women. That claim became the core of his defense in court. In everyday life, Sutcliffe did not come across as someone who was obviously mentally unstable. From the outside, his life looked fairly ordinary: a marriage, a steady job, a home, and a quiet routine. Neighbors remembered him as a polite, quiet man. In court, he said that at first he saw his actions as some kind of command from above, but that over time, that changed, and eventually it no longer mattered to him who the victim was: a prostitute, a student, or a housewife. According to him, the killings gradually became something like an addiction. One important detail was that he often partially undressed his victims. Investigators believed he did this so he could look at the injuries he had inflicted. The violence clearly did not end with murder itself. He kept mutilating the bodies after death. Later, Sutcliffe admitted that he deliberately changed parts of his method in order to throw police off track. That admission became one of the key points in deciding whether he understood the nature and consequences of what he was doing. At the same time, Sutcliffe flatly denied having anything to do with the letters and the audio tape that had misled the investigation for months. More than a quarter century later, DNA testing showed that the letters had actually been sent by John Samuel Humble, better known as Wearside Jack. He was arrested in 2005, and in 2006, he pleaded guilty to charges related to perverting the course of justice and was sentenced to 8 years in prison. It would be hard to call the investigation into the man who terrorized England for years a flawless success. During the hunt for the Ripper, Peter Sutcliffe was questioned 9 times, yet he was never seriously treated as the prime suspect. Later, Sutcliffe himself recalled one almost absurd moment. A police officer came to his house, showed him photographs of the shoe prints found at a crime scene, and at that very moment, Sutcliffe was wearing those exact boots. The officer never noticed. Sutcliffe later spoke about it with a smirk and wondered himself whether he had simply been lucky for far too long. But eventually, that luck ran out. On May 22, 1981, Peter William Sutcliffe was sentenced to 20 life terms. After the sentence, he began receiving dozens of letters from women who said they were in love with him. Some even came to visit him in prison, and with a few of them, he kept up a personal correspondence. In those letters, he was described as intelligent, attractive, and even charming. For a time, his ex-wife also stayed in contact with him despite the divorce. But behind that strange attention was a very different reality. Life behind bars was harsh for Sutcliffe. He was seen as one of the most hated prisoners in the country, and many inmates openly wanted to kill him. The first attack on Peter came on January 10, 1983, in the hospital wing of Parkhurst Prison. One inmate, James Costello, grabbed a broken glass jar and slashed Sutcliffe in the face twice. After that, it became clear that more attacks like this were likely. So in March 1984, to reduce the risk, Sutcliffe was transferred to Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital. On February 23, 1996, Peter Sutcliffe nearly died again. Convicted robber Paul Wilson asked him for a videotape, then tried to strangle him with the stereo headphone cord. Sutcliffe was saved by other patients who stepped in just in time. On March 10, 1997, he was attacked again, this time by Ian K., who stabbed him several times with the Parker pen. After that assault, Sutcliffe lost all sight in his left eye, and his right eye was so badly damaged that his vision was almost gone. On December 22, 2007, another patient, Patrick Sharada, came at him with a metal table knife and tried to strike his one remaining eye, but the blade missed and drove into his cheek instead. On November 13, 2020, Peter Sutcliffe died at the age of 74. According to available reports, he died of natural causes related to complications from diabetes. Shortly before that, he had been treated after a suspected heart attack and had also tested positive for COVID-19. Many people in Britain reacted to the news with relief. Even then, some investigators still believed Sutcliffe may have been connected to at least 22 more unsolved murders. What do you think about this case? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you in the next video.